Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's CETA-inspired workshop on small utility planning and reporting. My name is Austin Scharf. I am the Legislative and Rules Coordinator for the Energy Division at the Department of Commerce, and I'm going to be walking us through the introductory slides of today's presentation before handing the rest of the workshop over to my colleagues. Throughout the workshop, we want to hear your feedback and answer your questions. For those of you online, we encourage you to send questions in the WebEx chat box. Chat box icon can be found by going to the bottom of your window and clicking on the blue circle with the text bubble in it. You should then be able to send your questions to everyone using the chat box on your screen. Please note that Glenn Blackman will not be monitoring his chat box today. WebEx makes it difficult to do so when presenting a slideshow. So for convenience sake, please send your questions to everyone. This will ensure that we do not miss them. We have also structured question and answer times throughout today's presentation. We want these times to be as interactive as possible. In the past, we have asked participants to use the raise your hand function and wait to be called on before asking their question. However, we do not anticipate today's workshop to be as large as our others, even though it seems to be quite large at this time. So we will embark on a social experiment of sorts and ask everyone to simply unmute themselves when they have questions during question and answer times. If this does not work, we will go back to the raise your hand method. For those of you online, you can find the raise your hand button by opening the participants panel, which is to the left of the text bubble icon. Moving your cursor to the left of the mute unmute icon in the participant panel, a symbol in the shape of a hand should appear. Clicking on the symbol will raise your hand. If you raise your hand, please unraise it once you have asked your question. That will help us identify participants who still have questions. Over the course of our last few webinars, it has come to our attention that the raise your hand function fails to appear depending on how you opened WebEx. If you do not have the raise your hand function, no worries. Simply unmute yourself and ask your question during our Q&A sessions. For those of you who have joined today's workshop via landline, there is no option to unmute your phones and ask questions. If you would like to have the option to participate, we respectfully ask that you log into the workshop via computer or smartphone. With that, let's take a second to talk about the Department of Commerce. Next slide, please, Glenn. The Department of Commerce's goal is to strengthen communities across Washington. Our agency has over 110 programs covering everything from crime victims advocacy to infrastructure. It is also home to our state's Energy Policy Office, which is hosting today's workshop. So let's get to today's agenda. We are going to first wrap up this introduction with an overview of the rulemaking process. We are then going to review the goals of CETA and its planning requirements before taking a break at 10:30. After the break, we will discuss reporting requirements and low-income assistance, cover issues and concerns, as well as CETA compliance issues. We will conclude by looking forward at next steps in the CETA rulemaking process. In reverse alphabetical order by last name, our presenters today are Energy Policy Specialist Sarah Vorpal, myself, and Manager of the State's Energy Policy Office, Glenn Blackman. To conclude this introduction, let's talk about rulemaking. Rulemaking is composed of both formal and informal processes. The formal rulemaking process begins with a pre-proposal notice known as a CR 101. Once Commerce has consulted stakeholders through workshops like these, it puts forward its proposed rule, or CR 102. After the CR 102 is published, a public hearing is held 20 days later. Written and verbal comments are accepted at the hearing. Commerce then files a CR 103 and a concise explanatory statement which summarizes the rules and stakeholder comments. The rules become effective 31 days later. That is the formal rulemaking process. In reality, the process is much more informal and iterative. We conduct workshops, circulate draft rules, and collect stakeholder comments in the days, weeks, and months leading up to the filing of our proposed rules. That is the CR 102. Looking at our CETA rulemaking milestones, we have been in the workshop, draft rule, and stakeholder comment phase of our rulemaking since July 30th of 2019. On December 31st, 2019, we adopted rules around the social cost of carbon and incremental hydro. We have since continued our informal process. On December 31st, 2020, we will adopt most of the rules for CETA. The next year, we will adopt a cumulative impact rule, and the following year, we will adopt rules around electricity markets. Glenn or Sarah, did I miss anything? And do we have any questions from participants at this time?
That looks good to me, Austin.
All right, with that, Sarah, are you up?
That's me. Great. So I'm going to kick us off today. First of all, hi, everyone. Good to have so many online virtually. Thank you for being flexible during this time. You know, as Austin said, we really do want to make this an interactive experience. So please do, you know, take opportunity to ask questions. We'll be pausing at the end of each chunk of presentation for clarifying questions. And we're also going to be holding time at the end, as was mentioned. So if there's stuff that's bubbling up throughout, we'll let you know. So I'm going to talk through the Clean Energy Transformation Act, the main goals of the Act. And so these are all the pieces that are getting us on a roadmap to this 100% clean goal. So to start, we will be removing coal from the portfolio by 2025. The second goal, which is actually the one that's going to be most relevant probably to our conversation today, both in its timing, but also in its kind of all the pieces that are part of it, is the 2030 greenhouse gas neutral standard. And so, you know, just beyond the standard itself, there's some pieces that we just want to take a second and highlight to know that there is not just kind of one piece of it, maybe like the coal standard, but several pieces. So the first, which is probably familiar to many, is that utilities, as part of this goal, must pursue all cost-effective energy efficiency resources. And then for the remaining load, at least 80% must come from renewable or non-emitting sources. And so when you're thinking non-emitting, you're thinking about nuclear. And so, you know, most of the utilities on the line today are probably somewhere around this 80% goal or above it. But, you know, there are still some other pieces of this standard that we want to make sure to go through. So, you know, you can get at least 80% of your compliance through you have to get 80% of your compliance through renewable and non-emitting resources, but you can also do 20% through what's called an alternative compliance option. And so these alternative compliance options, there's 4 of them. And just to kind of go through them quickly, we can have more time to dig in at the end as well, but they include making an alternative compliance payment, which is basically the cost of the administrative penalty for non-compliance, including some multipliers for different fuel generation types. There's using unbundled RECs, which has many different pieces and parts of that conversation that we can also talk about later. There's using an energy transformation project, which some of you may have heard of. So these projects are about additional conservation and efficiency that's beyond what's required in this greenhouse gas neutral standard itself. And the Department of Ecology, along with some other departments, are doing the rulemaking for that, and they'll be having their next workshop sometime in May. And then the last alternative compliance option is a specific one. It's using electricity from an energy recovery facility that uses municipal solid waste and was constructed prior to 1992. So to translate that, this provision allows the utility to use electricity generated at the Spokane Municipal Solid Waste Incinerator. So then, you know, in addition to meeting these requirements in terms of, you know, fuel type, there's also a piece of the greenhouse gas neutral standard that mandates that all customers must benefit from the transition to clean energy. And that transition and that kind of piece of the standard has kind of 3 pieces to it. So, you know, in ensuring that all customers benefit from the transition, you must do so through long-term and short-term public health and environmental benefits and reductions of costs and risks, energy security and resiliency, And then you also must ensure that, in all that work, there's an equitable distribution of both energy and non-energy benefits, as well as reduction of burdens to different communities that are designated in CETA. And those communities include tribes, communities that experience disproportionate risks from environmental burdens, such as people that have limited access to food and health, or maybe high rates of hospitalization. And then there's also communities identified using a cumulative impact analysis tool that's being developed by the Department of Health. That is also work that's ongoing, and you can track through their website and process. And then finally, that gets us to our last goal. We're going to hit the 2045, 100% renewable or non-emitting energy. So I'll pause for a second there and see if there are any clarifying questions about these goals. And as Austin mentioned, feel free to just unmute yourself and speak up if you'd like to ask a question.
So this is Nicholas Garcia. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hi, Nicholas.
Hi, I'm testing this out. I haven't done this way before. I just have one question about the goals. It seems to me that everything you say is in the act, but it also has some safeguards also built into the act that haven't been mentioned, that the achievement of the policy doesn't result in an unreliable system or impose unreasonable costs on utility customers. And it seems to me that that's a very important safeguard that we should be mentioning when we're talking about the goals, because sometimes they're going to be challenging to meet. Those goals will be challenging to meet and still end up with a reliable and a reasonably cost system.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Nicholas, for that comment. And I think we're going to have opportunity to dig a little bit more into those pieces as we move on, but important to note up front as well. Thank you.
We have a raised hand from ML Norton.
And just a little trick, if you're on your phone and the computer, you have to both unmute your phone and unmute yourself on the browser. A mistake I've made often. All right. Perhaps we can try again. And if there's questions we missed because of technology errors, we can come back to the end, or you can also type them into the chat box. Oh, hello.
Hey, Sarah, this is Liz Klump.
Hi, Liz. Yeah, hi, Liz.
I have a quick one. Feeling like I haven't read the statute in a while. So when you rattled off the list of describing the language under all customers must benefit, are those points basically embedded in the statute?
They are, yeah. Thank you for the question.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Thanks. Nope, that was it. Thanks.
Yeah, it was pretty much verbatim from, if you are looking at the statute, 19405, it's in section 4, subsection 8. So it lists out these three different provisions within that mandate.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions just to clarify any of the goals that I mentioned? All right. Well, as I said, we can also, we'll have time at the end to collect anything that is left dangling. In the meantime, Glenn, why don't we go to the next slide? And I'm going to pass it over to Glenn, in fact, to talk us through planning requirements under CETA. And Glenn, if you're talking, we can't hear you. And Glenn, oh, there you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
has raised her hand. Like I'm coming in twice. Is the sound okay or?
It sounds fine to me, Glenn. I think you're good to go.
Okay. About, I've lost my ability to flip the slides. Sorry, everybody. All right. Can people see a slide that says planning requirements for CETA?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So this is just to kind of give background or the context under the state resource planning law. The large utilities, generally ones that have more than 25,000 customers, do an integrated resource plan. There are 16 utilities that submitted those in the last cycle in 2018. And then smaller utilities and also a few larger utilities that are, you know who you are. They submit a much briefer plan called a resource plan. There are about 45 utilities that are in that group. And this is the group that really we're aiming this workshop for today. These are the ones who have not had for the most part, haven't had to work with the Energy Independence Act and the Renewable Portfolio Standard that's in that law. And have not been doing integrated resource plans in the past. And this slide, again, this is not the things that the small utilities have to do. It's more for the purpose of contrast that I'm showing this. These are the changes due to CETA to the integrated resource plan requirements. So there are really quite a few new things that have to be considered or addressed in an IRP. They're listed here. Some of the big ones include establishing a specific resource adequacy standard, looking at the regional generation and transmission capacity, incorporating distributed energy resources, energy and non-energy benefits, and then they need to do what's called a clean energy action plan that goes over the next 10 years. So that's what the large utilities, what the changes they saw as a result of CETA. And then for the smaller utilities, the ones that do resource plans, there's really a single provision added to that section. That is that they identify over a 10-year period how the utility plans to implement these two new standards, the greenhouse gas neutral standard and the 100% clean standard. The one that 2030 and the one in 2045 that Sarah mentioned. And on this slide, we restate those provisions for the greenhouse neutral standard in 040. So I won't go through those again. Under the 100% clean standard, one thing that I think it's easy to overlook is if you the resource plan statute itself doesn't say that you need to do something specific for 100% clean. But when you go to the 19405-050, it says in there that that standard needs to be incorporated into all relevant planning and resource acquisition practices. So the way we're looking at it is that that means that then it does need to be incorporated into the resource plan work that the utilities are doing. Now, it's there may not necessarily be any action that a utility is going to take during the next 10 years to comply with that standard that takes effect in 2045. But it is, it needs to be within the planning criteria. And then the other provision that's in that is a new explicit authority for utilities to work together in their planning. I don't really new authority or anything like that, but if anybody had any doubt about their ability to collaborate, it's spelled out. So the bigger new thing, it seems to me, for the small utilities is the Clean Energy Implementation Plan. And I've the site to the legislative section that has that. In that section, there's a single provision that applies to all of the consumer-owned utilities, whether they're doing an IRP or a resource plan. There's not that distinction with a simplified approach for smaller utilities. That's a single set of requirements apply for all the utilities. This is a requirement that starts by submitting a plan by January 1st, 2022. It requires that every 4 years they prepare this plan. It'll have interim targets for meeting those two standards that we talked about. And interim in this context, as far as we can tell, means during that period from 2022 to 2030, and then also between 2030 and 45 targets heading toward that 100% clean standard that takes effect in 2045. And then it requires specific targets for 3 things: energy efficiency, demand response, and renewable resources. It's CEIP needs to be informed by those 10-year plans that we talked about before. In the case of small utilities, that would be the 10-year action plan that is added to the resource plan requirement. And then it says that it needs to be consistent with the 2% rate impact threshold provision that's in that same section. This is one of the safeguards that Nicholas mentioned earlier that allows the utility to not go all the way to the 2030 standard. If doing it would require that it spend more than 2% increase in revenue on the actions that are required to meet that standard. So it's sort of a throttle on the requirement to make progress toward that standard. And then finally, it says that the utility needs to identify specific actions to demonstrate progress toward those 2 standards. And so that is the last slide that I have in this section. And I know that this is, one of the first sets of requirements in the law, time that utilities are going to be looking at. 2022 is not very far away. And so uh, answer questions or get suggestions about if there's things that might be clarified in the rules to make it easier to understand and comply correctly with the statute. Those are the sort of things we'd like to identify through this workshop.
Glenn, we have two comments in the chat box. The first one is Commerce considering any rules regarding the different sizes of utilities within the small group? For some utilities, it seems this planning for the amount of accounts is overly burdensome.
I think we're open to suggestions around that. I think it's worth recognizing that the legislature itself has done some of that, making a distinction between larger utilities and smaller ones. We looked at the new utilities and the integrated resource plans compared to the new requirements for the small utilities, and there's a pretty significant adjustment that's been made for the small utilities there. And as far as I
Hey, Glenn,
know, everybody has acknowledges that if you're buying all your power from a single source, then there are going to be fewer kind of resource acquisition decisions that you may need to make. So it could be that even if a big utility's kind of checking all the different boxes that a small utility is, that the utility are simpler. Just even if the requirements of the plan itself are not simpler.
Hey,
Anyway, I
Glenn,
think
this is Greg.
there.
This is Greg Mendonca with P&GC Power. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Greg. Good morning.
Perfect. Good morning. I was the one who submitted that, so I have. I think I've talked to you just briefly about this, but so we have a couple. When we're looking at this, we have a couple concerns because I think that the break in large, above 25,000 and sub 25,000 accounts stemming from the previous legislation was fine for that. And then when you're looking at this in terms of doing all of these plans, what we've brought up and what we're concerned about is we have, for example, two utilities who are Idaho-based that have a very small subset of their accounts that are in Washington State. So one of them has approximately 10% of their system, or maybe 2 average megawatts or so, in Washington State. One of them has literally 10 accounts, like 10 members in Washington State. And I'm looking at these and I'm thinking, this is not for them. And the conversations we've had before, it's been indicated that there's purposely no minimum in terms of size of small utility. But when we're in this process, I would really think that we want to be very cognizant that the administrative burden, even though, I understand what you're saying, well, maybe your answers are simple, but it still takes resources and it still takes time, even if you're aggregating up to a single entity doing it for multiple people. That resource and time for 10 accounts to try to figure out what the rate impact is, try to figure out how to make those 10 accounts meet the standards. I see Doug Elliott also throwing in 140 accounts for his utility. I think we need to address that because I think it's not as a bright line as everyone under 25,000 should do this. I think the state needs to recognize that there's small and there's very small, and I don't know where that line is drawn, but the administrative burden of performing plans, turning them into Commerce, having Commerce review them, seems like it's addressing a non-issue when it comes to these types of utilities. And they're all, I mean, they're going to have different views on it. My perspective is I think we need to address that, and we need to look at it in this lens that there are entities that will spend more money performing this than they get revenue out of a certain subset of customers over the entire year, perhaps. And how do we address that and make sure that we're not putting undue burden on those utilities?
Well, that seems like a great concern to try to work through and see. I mean, first of all, really what the burden does look like. And, you know, that's something we'd want to explore with you and see in more detail of what it takes to prepare a clean energy implementation plan if you're if you're a small, ultra small utility. And then to look at the statute itself and see what opportunities there are for, you know, an easier standard in terms of reporting or, you know, kind of the record keeping stuff than the larger utilities might have.
Hey, Glenn?
Yeah.
Hey, this is Doug Elliott with Kootenai Electric Cooperative. I thought I might just weigh in on this. We haven't done extensive research on how much this would cost us. Part of the reason why I'm participating in the conference today, just to learn more. But it's very difficult for us to hire a consultant to do any type of study and not spend $30,000 to $40,000 for that. And this looks to be a fairly routine investment of consulting services. We don't have the staff to do this. We'd have to hire this out. And if I spread $30,000 or $40,000 over 140 customers, I'm talking about $23 a month per customer. That's almost as much as our fixed charge is. So just kind of put into context what that administrative burden looks like for a utility of our size. I really agree that this is something that if the rules could help address, it would really be beneficial to us.
Thank you for that comment, Doug. I appreciate.
We have one more comment in the chat box, Glenn, and then we have someone with their hand raised. So going to the comment first. So does the 2% rate impact only apply to the cost of this program? If BPA has a 6% rate increase, we can only pass on 2%? Question. And then they mentioned that their utility has only 1,100 accounts.
So, I guess I want to first say that my guess is that none of the utilities that are BPA full requirements customers are going to need to figure out what the 2% rate impact requires or allows or how it works, because it's costs that are directly attributable to comply with those two standards, the greenhouse gas neutral standard and the 100% clean standard. If those would exceed in any year, well, actually over a 4-year period, if the average cost of that compliance exceeded 2% of utilities revenue per year, then you could make slower complying with those standards. And so if a utility is already well above the 80% renewable or non-emitting mix of resources, then it seems to me like it's unlikely that they would need to use that 2% rate impact measure. if they do, then I think there's no doubt that it's a complicated thing to work through. It just seems like it may not come up for many of the smaller utilities. And it certainly doesn't limit the utilities' ability to pass through PA rate increase or otherwise set the rates that the utilities governing board feels are the reasonable rates for that utility. It's rather, it describes a circumstance where the utility could limit its investment expenditures for things that are attributable to these two standards.
And then we have ML Norton with his or her hand raised. Will you unmute yourself and ask your question, please? It appears you have unmuted yourself. Not getting any audio. So maybe it is a headset problem. In the past, when we have had audio problems like this, we encourage everyone to call in using a smartphone, and they can follow on their computer and also partake in the conversation. There's nothing on my end that I can do to assist, so we'll continue to move on unless we have further questions.
So this is Nicholas Garcia. I have a question.
Morning, Nicholas.
Good morning, Glenn. I hope you're well. My question has to do with the requirement that a utility is 100% clean by 2045. In that same section of the bill or the law, it says that nothing in this section prohibits an electric utility from purchasing or exchanging power with the Bonneville Power Administration. So my question is, if Bonneville isn't 100% clean and you have free reign to buy power from Bonneville, how is that going to impact both the resource plan, if you say that our plan is to buy from Bonneville as permitted by the law, and the plan itself in terms of meeting the 100% clean mandate?
I'm not sure about that, Nicholas. Haven't given a lot of thought to the meaning of that provision. So I guess we just have to see if we can figure out what that means. Sorry.
Oh, that's fine. I guess my recommendation would be to say that given this specific provision in the statute, that if a utility is relying on BPA, that it is in compliance with the mandate. And it's also, if you say in your plan that we're going to be buying all of our power from BPA, you are in compliance with the plan's mandate.
Something to look at.
Hey, Glenn, this is Greg Mendonca again with PNGC. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hey, I wanted to do a follow-up on the 2% question and discussion that you guys were walking through there, and bring it to kind of the same example that I had before. So some of our members are multi-state utilities with the small subset of accounts in Washington State again. And I don't know 100% for sure, and perhaps Doug Elliott might be a good sanity check on this as well. But if they don't differentiate rates in their service territory for residential accounts, for example, how does Commerce imagine looking at a rate impact threshold for entities like that. So let's say there's 20,000 accounts, 10 of them are in Washington State. What does the 2% apply to? Is it the 20,000 accounts or is it the 10 accounts? And what would Commerce's guidance be in terms of passing through or looking at the costs of a program like this in that situation? Would they anticipate that those costs would flow directly to their Washington constituents, or would they plan them to be socialized across an entire multi-state utility?
I think on your question, Greg, the revenues would only be the Washington retail revenues, and you'd compare the costs of those necessary investments to the Washington revenue, and use that to figure out whether the 2% limit is reached, or I should say threshold, really, rather than limit, because it doesn't require that you use less than that. As far as the costs of this statute are recovered from customers, that I'm not going to offer any guidance or advice on that. This law makes it pretty clear that utilities retain the authority to set rates for their own customers, and so we don't have any expectation one way or the other about what a multi-utility would do.
And that's fair. That's probably an unfair question for me, so I appreciate that. The 2% rate impact threshold, would that include the types of administrative costs that would go into performing the clean energy implementation plan, things of that nature?
It's a good question. It may be a complicated question because the standards are in a different section than this one that we're looking at here, this 060.
Yeah.
So we'd have to sort that out, but
I think you see what I'm getting at in terms of the examples that we're running, which is if the cost to complete a clean energy implementation plan is greater than a 2% impact on the revenues that you would get from those folks, is that a way to essentially say, listen, if the cost to just administratively figure out what an implementation plan looks like is going to be greater than 2% of the revenue you get from this subset of folks, maybe that's a way to identify that that's a group of utilities perhaps that are the small, I'll put it.
yeah. Well, I hope that the small utilities will also kind of get together, like with you, Greg, and maybe with Kent at the Co-op Association, and maybe a kind of single clean energy implementation plan template that would work for all the full requirements customers, and maybe it wouldn't cost $30,000 per utility to produce.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And I think for P&GC members, I think we can put something together for all of them, but not everybody has that ability, and that not every Washington co-op is a member. But yeah, I think I hear what you're saying, but I think that might be something that Commerce can consider in terms of trying. You're kind of looking for suggestions on how to identify how there might be different different folks within the small utility group. That might be something to look at.
Yeah, that sounds good. And, we'd be happy to be some kind of exploration of a simplified reporting form or something like that.
Thank you.
All right, Glenn, we have another question. It was by Doug. He wrote, if the amount of renewable energy provided by BPA exceeded the full energy requirements of our Washington customers' requirements, would any further reporting obligations exist?
I'm not understand that question. I'm sorry.
Maybe Doug can chime in here.
Yeah. Thanks, Glenn. Yeah, so I guess the nature of my question is if we can demonstrate that Bonneville is already providing X amount of compliant energy under the plan, and we can demonstrate as a utility that that amount of energy exceeds the total amount of energy that we are selling to our Washington customers, then are we not already then in compliance? And then does anything else need to be reported to demonstrate that? You wouldn't have to incur that consulting fee because you could already demonstrate quickly your compliance. You don't have to demonstrate a plan to get to somewhere where you already are.
I think that if you were able to, in some way, allocate your BPA power constituent resources where your Washington customers are receiving 100% compliant resources and the unspecified power, natural gas or anything like that being allocated to non-Washington customers, then you would have a much simpler clean energy implementation plan to submit. You're on that particular count, you would be at 100%, and so your plan would be to stay at 100%. There may still need to be some target setting for energy efficiency and demand response, and plan may also need to identify those big actions, some of which would go to those equitable distribution of benefits requirements. So I don't know that it would completely eliminate the need to produce a plan, but it may simplify it.
All right. Well, thank you for that response.
Sure.
We have Jeff with his hand raised. Jeff, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Jeff, if you're talking, we cannot hear you. So you might need to unmute yourself either on your phone or headset.
Or make sure that your microphone is turned on your computer. While we wait for Jeff, are there any other questions?
So this is Nicholas Garcia again. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble raising my hand, so I'm not exactly sure what's going on. Otherwise, I would have done that before. But in any case, so my question is kind of dovetails off of some earlier comments about the small utilities. At some point, you have very few customers over which to spread fixed costs. And I guess we are thinking that it makes sense for the smaller utilities to be able to set a specific target for something like conservation at 0, because nothing's cost effective if you're spreading, an FTE over 140 customers or maybe even 1,400. And so I guess I just want to find out if that is what Commerce's thoughts might be to that position.
One of the things that we really haven't figured out through the rulemaking is the methodology that needs to be used to determine the amount of conservation that is available and cost effective. I mean, the methodology for the small utilities. We know that the larger ones need to use the same methodology that the Power Council uses. And so, I mean, I guess that you'd come up with a methodology that yields that result of zero cost-effective energy efficiency. The other thing I'd want to look at the role of the Bonneville Power Administration. You know, they have conservation programs and requirements of their own that go through to individual customers. And so you want to look at those programs too in terms of figuring out what a small utility as a customer of BP should be expected to do.
All right, we also have Falkenberg with her hand raised. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question? If not, we have a chat question, which is if the conversation associated with full requirements customers, BPA applicable only to load following customers?
You know, there's a definition in the resource planning state statute 19.280 about what a full requirements customer is. And we just have to look at that. And I don't know if it makes a distinction between, you know, what type of contract the utility has with BPA. Liz Klump is on. Well, I don't know if Liz, you have an opinion about that or?
Well, when it comes to what I think you referred to as 19.280, is that the resource plan law?
Yeah.
You know, that hasn't involved us heavily, so I don't recall if it's just small or if it's full requirements. But I did want to mention, just, you know, for clarity's sake, on the energy efficiency, you know, Bonneville continues to work with our utilities to offer programs, and on behalf of all our customers, we continue to support the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance. So I'm not aware of an electric utility in the Northwest that is a Bonneville customer that won't be investing in energy efficiency at least in the near term. But I haven't checked 19.280 in a while.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. But thank you.
Jeff, I believe you called in. I don't know if you still have a question, but if you'd like to pose it, you can unmute yourself.
And Jeff, we still can't hear you if you are talking right now.
We apologize for any time. Does anyone else have a question at this time?
Austin, I see things kind of flying by in the chat box.
Yes, one
They
question.
don't stay on my screen long enough to actually read.
So we have one question here. Will utilities be required to invest in conservation above the conservation efforts it is already involved in with BPA?
I don't think we know the answer to the question yet. This is a requirement under state law that they acquire all energy efficiency that's available and cost effective. And whether the BPA conservation is sufficient to meet that requirement is unknown to me, at least.
We have another question posed by ML Norton. It reads, the COVID-19 pandemic has pointed to the need for adequate, reliable, resilient power system that is available 24/7, 365 days a year. Does CETA not threaten that requirement? Does SB 6135 that was passed and signed into law during the 2020 legislative session call for the evaluation of the grid's adequacy? Sorry, another comment came in and lost my place. Call for the evaluation of the grid's adequacy and mandates it be maintained.
Do you finish that, Greg?
Yes. Yeah, so the first is a question about CETA and adequate, reliable, and resilient power. The second question, does the legislation call for an evaluation of the grid's adequacy, that it be maintained?
Yeah. So the Clean Energy Transformation Act reinforced the importance of a reliable and adequate supply of electricity for the state. For safeguards and analysis requirements in the statute to ensure that we don't threaten reliability. And that's true both kind of at the statewide level, but also for individual utilities to make that assessment. And so the crisis that we have on the health front, I think would be one example of certain things that might come up where we need to make sure that we have reliable electric service. And I don't think that when you look at CETA overall, there's any threat to the reliability of the system as a result of that law. And now after all that, I've forgotten the second question, Austin, sorry.
Does the Senator Sheldon's bill that passed this session, does it call for an evaluation of the grid's adequacy and mandate that it's maintained?
Yeah, we did get a bill passed this session by Senator Sheldon and Senator Carlisle, actually, that were the two sponsors of it. And it requires that once a year, the Department of Commerce and the UTC convene a meeting where we'll consult with the stakeholders and experts and things like that about the implementation of CETA and whether it's presenting any reliability concerns. This is kind of a interim status check provision where there's a bigger report that comes up kind of mid-decade that the Department of Commerce will be preparing, where we'll be consulting with a lot of kind of the experts in the region on resource adequacy. And at that point, we are expecting that we'll have clearer resource adequacy standards, adopted by the utilities. And so that is kind of the big review on the status of the grid. Senate Bill 6135 did provide for these meetings.
So Jeff Johnson has submitted his question. His question is, I understand there's an interim...
Austin, it's a bit difficult. Austin, it's a bit difficult to hear you. There's a bunch of noise. Sorry, I just wanted to pause for a second. It's just a bit difficult to hear you.
Okay.
Can you try again? Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for flagging that for me. Jeff Johnson's question is, I understand there's an interim target requirement which will be taking place in 2022, 2026, and 2030. Contracts and other variables impact our ability to incrementally improve our position in each of these components year over year. I hope there is not the thinking that year over year improvements will be realized so much as longer term milestones.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. The interim targets are for 4-year periods, so from 2022 to 2025, 2020 to 2029. And then once we get into the greenhouse gas neutral standard being in effect in 2030, there also are 4-year periods where compliance is measured. And so I wouldn't expect to see annual targets, but instead more of those targets that are applied to those periods. And of course, for a utility that's already well above 80%, the interim targets for resources, that may be pretty modest changes from one 4-year period to the next.
Glenn, if you're still talking, we can't hear you. I wasn't sure if you paused or your audio cut out. All right. Glenn, just one more check. If you're talking, we still can't hear you.
I'm not talking.
Oh, okay. You didn't say anything, so.
Do we have any other questions at this time, either about CETA's goals or the planning requirements or the interaction between the two?
So this is Nicholas Garcia again. One last question on interim targets. It seems to me that there is a large uncertainty going forward, and that is the 2028 BPA contracts. Coupled that with some of the larger of the small utilities will have other contracts where they buy and sell power. And I'm just curious if from Commerce's perspective, if a utility is well above the 80% threshold, but in any given 4-year period, the amount of non-emitting or renewable resources goes down, rather than up. Do you see any issues associated with that from an enforcement standpoint, or is that just normal variation that happens because the world is uncertain?
Nicholas, that might depend on the factors behind that variation. There certainly is in the that the availability of hydro varies from year to year. And so in the provision where it says to set interim targets, it also acknowledges that there is that variation where it's not necessarily the target would vary from year to year, but the achievement relative to that target might very well vary. Though, once you start averaging it over a 4-year period, that it diminishes some, but it could still exist. If there were more of a business decision made to reduce the use of renewable and non-emitting as you head toward 2030, that one, I don't know, I'd want to understand more about how that came to be.
I guess the question I'm asking is this: do you view the interim target numbers as a binding commitment, or do you see them as a target? And so that's question number one. And question number two is, do you see the requirement that you demonstrate progress to require that the proportion of electricity from renewable and non-emitting resources rises every 4 years, or do you see that as a target? As with regard to that, I would just point out that the statute itself says you propose interim targets, not you set them. So with that information, what would your response be to those two questions?
I think that we still haven't resolved what the consequences are for a utility that sets an interim target and then doesn't meet it. It's not as clear as it is after 2030 what the consequences are. And so that could mean that there is no consequence before 2030. I just don't think of that yet.
Okay, thank you.
This is Greg Mendonca. Can I follow up on that? I'm trying to wrap my head around a situation why there would be a consequence. Could you give me an example of why there would be a consequence for missing an interim target for this?
I'm not sure that I can. The law does require that utilities work toward achieving that 2030 standard, or the greenhouse gas neutral standard in 2030. And
yeah,
so I just don't really know whether there would be consequence for a utility that said, well, we're not going to do that. We'll when it comes to 2030, we'll comply. Maybe there would be no consequence for that. I'm just not sure.
Okay. I'm just trying to wrap my head around that, and I apologize for jumping in and asking that, because I thought that the consequences for utilizing non-renewable or non-emitting generation was already spelled out in terms of those penalty rates per megawatt hour for the different technologies. So I think to me that seemed pretty clear. If you move away and you start utilizing the non-renewable or emitting generation, then there are financial penalties. But I'm having a hard time understanding, if you're doing a multi-year plan, why there would be penalties for missing something like that. If folks penalize people for being wrong on their load forecast, I'm pretty sure every load forecaster would be out of business. So that's just thinking about that in this perspective, and thinking as to why there'd be any reason for penalizing for not being able to forecast variables appropriately.
Yep. And of course, there are lots of variations around that, whether a variation between a target and an actual is due to a difference in load, or whether it's the utility, purchased a natural gas plant, the pretty different, a variation between a target and actual.
Yep, I understand. Okay, thank you.
And we have a question, Abby. Her question is, if the measure taken the progress toward the targets aren't identified in the plan, will credit still be given, or do only measures identified in the plan count?
I guess I would hope that anything that a utility does to move towards that 2030 target, should they should get credit for doing that, whether it was anticipated when they wrote their clean energy implementation plan or not.
We have also a question from Dan. Dan Drews. What is the penalty going to be for not meeting the 100% 2030 goal? Utilities will need now to know this in order to weigh the costs of meeting the standard versus just paying the penalty.
This is a question about the 100% clean standard.
2030.
Penalties for that are set out in the statute, on the order of $100 per megawatt hour of, where you don't reach that 80% renewable, or if you didn't if you were at 80%, then you'd also need to have the alternative compliance options for the other 20%. So the penalty is calculated on per megawatt.
We had Humara Falkenberg, if I'm pronouncing your first name correctly. Raise their hand. Would you like to ask your question? Need to unmute yourself first. While we wait, does anyone else have any questions? Want to jump into the conversation? Pose a question either about CETA's goals or the planning requirements.
This is Abby. Can you hear me?
Should we move to our morning break?
Well, there's Abby is trying to, I think, ask a question. I see that you're talking, Abby.
Am I able to be heard?
It's very muddled. It's hard to hear you.
Okay. Just please be mindful. I'm representing two utilities, one with 240 customers and one with less than 1,500. These unfunded mandates are
Abby, I'm sorry. It's we can't understand the question. I mean, maybe you can, Glenn. It's a bit muddled for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe you can put it into the chat box. And it looks like we have one more, and we have about 10 more minutes for questions before we move to our break. So
Sure.
Looks like we have one in the chat box, Austin.
Yeah. Emil Norton just submitted another question. If there are several utilities that buy from BPA for 100% of their power needs, then can the portfolio that BPA provides be used to penalize the utilities that use BPA?
I'm not sure kind of what the question is. There would not be any penalties on, certainly no penalties on BPA, no penalties on utilities outside of Washington. I have a feeling that's not really responsive to the question, though. I'm sorry.
If you'd like
There's
to-
one.
There's another. How will the state interpret unspecified resources? I believe this is regarding BPA resources.
So unspecified resources do not qualify as being renewable or non-emitting. So under the 30 standard, the EPA's resource mix would be in that 20% category that is not renewable or non-emitting. One way that a utility might get to full compliance would be to purchase unbundled renewable energy credits to match the unspecified resources within the BPA mix.
Hey, Glenn, can I expand on that for a minute? This is Liz Klump.
Sure.
So I'm going to expand just because it's possible that some people on this call aren't tracking this as much as some of us. So Glenn gave a really good example. Let's say it's 2030 and Bonneville has 4% unspecified power in its system sale. So for example, Glenn said you could go out and buy unbundled RECs equal to the megawatt hours that you buy from us that's unspecified. There's also a whole category in the statute about energy transformation projects, which the state is still doing rulemaking on to create some clarity on what those options are and what they mean. And in that case, they'll be measured in greenhouse gas reduction units. So there are some alternatives. Unspecified is not carbon free. And that's all I wanted to add. Thanks.
So we had a follow-up question that says, so does that mean that Washington utilities that purchase all of their power from BPA will be assessed a penalty?
That would depend on whether the utility takes other actions to reach full compliance. You know, we've talked along the way here about a number of things that may be changing between now and 2030. BPA contracts, the way BPA and other utilities identify resources that they're buying and selling in the market is another. Where just because things are doesn't mean that they're actually unknowable. And we have some hope that the market mechanisms are going to change in a way that reduces the amount of unspecified power that shows up in the BPA mix. But if you just say, well, things are going to be just like they are in 2030 as they are now, and if you look at mix today, it would not comply with the 2030 standard as far as I can tell. So the utility would need to take some actions to get itself into compliance with that 2030 standard. And if it didn't, be subject to penalty.
So, Glenn, this is Nicholas. Would like to follow up on that question or that statement because are you referring to the fact that Bonneville has some coal in their resources, or are you referring to something else?
I, I wasn't aware of BPA having any coal in their resources.
Well, I was
It's just the unspecified power that I was thinking about.
okay. And I guess the question gets back to the point I made earlier, which is the act is very clear in my mind that says that there's nothing in the act that prevents someone from buying power from BPA. If you're a full requirements customer, I don't know what other actions you could take to be, um, to be compliant if if you are indeed a full requirements customer at BPA. So could you give us some ideas about what you're thinking?
Talk about the 2030 standard.
That's what I thought you were talking about. Maybe I misunderstood.
I mean, earlier we were talking about the 2045 standard, and there it's like, well, what do you do? I'm not sure. But under the 2030 standard, you've got those alternative compliance options. So to purchase unbundled renewable energy credits or to invest in energy transformation projects. I think the most likely method while using 100% BPA power.
Okay, so maybe I misunderstood, and I apologize if I'm taking everyone's time inappropriately, but then what we're talking about is the off chance that BPA comes in for a full requirements customer at less than 80% carbon free or or non-emitting. That's the scenario we're dealing with at this moment.
No, I was thinking if let's say BPA is 95% renewable or non-emitting and 5% unspecified. So a utility that's using BPA power entirely would buy enough RECs to cover that 5% that's unspecified, and it would be in compliance with that particular part of the greenhouse gas neutral standard.
Okay, thank you. Now it's much clearer. Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure.
And Glenn, along those lines, we had a question or a statement. In 2018, BPA had 3% of its resources as unspecified. And then the comment, a small utility has no ability to control BPA's purchase of unspecified resources.
Yeah, and I agree with that statement. But the utility does have options to sort of comp power is not 100% non-emitting or renewable. Purchase of renewable energy certificates happen without making any changes to the purchases from BPA itself.
Greg,
All right, with that, oh, I'm sorry.
Greg has
this will be our last question. Our last question.
Last question, Greg.
Yep. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. So I just wanted to make sure that I was understanding because I think we're bouncing around between the fuel mix and then what to do in the 2030 to 2045, 2030 standard versus 2045 standard. So for the situation of, let's say BPA just has 5% unspecified and let's just pretend the rest is renewable or non-emitting. For the 2030 standard, a utility would, to fully comply, would have to cover the 5% unspecified with RECs, something else, an energy transformation project. Question mark?
I think that I would agree with that so far, yeah.
And then 2045, if you're in the same exact situation and BPA delivers 95% renewable or non-emitting, there really is no mechanism to do anything with that 5% unspecified. Is that correct?
You know, there's not that specific provision for alternative compliance options.
Okay, I think that's obviously something that Liz probably is thinking about as well as we're staring out into the future.
Yeah, and this is Liz Klump with Bonneville, and I'll just take a second to say, you know, we have a number of power account executives on the call and some of my colleagues, but we're absolutely tracking this. And, you know, Kent Lopez and Nick are very aware that we're prepared to engage in conversations with our Washington customers when they're ready. So we are very much thinking about, you know, is there a product that our Washington customers might want that we are able to deliver? Now, I make no promises in that statement, but we're prepared to have those conversations. That's it. Thanks.
Great. Well, with that, we should go ahead and take our planned morning break. Thank you, everyone, so much for participating. We're going to go ahead and, if we can flip to the next slide, Glenn. The next part of the presentation, we're going to be talking about some of the reporting. So it'd be a good chance to take a look at this illustrative schedule of plans and reports that will be due for small utilities. This is available on our website. We can throw that into the chat box and have that available to you to go and look at this. But yeah, this will be good to kind of review as we move into the next part of the workshop. And so we'll come back at 10:35.
10:35?
Oh, excuse me, I thought it was 10:35, but is it 10:45? I'm sorry. Yes, 10:45 is correct.
There we go. I like that.
All right. So give everyone a little extra wiggle room, and we'll come back at 10:45. Thanks.
Right. Thank you. This is Glenn Blackman. People hear me?
Yes, we can hear
Yes.
you.
I think we're ready to start back. Thank everybody for sticking with this. There are, when we talk about the work that's involved with the Clean Energy Transformation Act, we talk about planning work, and then we also talk about reporting. And it's not a perfectly clean distinction to make between those two things, part because what you report may depend on what you planned, and vice versa. Both of those things depend on underlying requirements that you're either planning for or reporting on. But in any case, we put together and offered up for you on the website this illustrative schedule of plans, abilities. It's definitely a draft. In particular, the dates that are shown in that are kind of, at this point, our best guesses for some things. I mean, things that we know when you have to do it, like say in the statute that by January 1st, 2022, you have to submit a clean energy implementation plan. But there are other things that are, it may be that in the rulemaking we specify a particular date, and it might not be quite the one that's listed there. But anyway, we hope that that'll be helpful, letting utilities and stakeholders see the pattern of reporting and planning over the coming years. Of course, we only took it out for 2026, and it doesn't stop there. So, anyway, I'm going to, which is about reporting requirements in CETA. There really are 4 areas of reporting that we think about under this law. The first one is greenhouse gas emissions reporting, and it's maybe one of the smallest aspects of the Clean Energy Transformation Act, and it's not really kind of an independent reporting activity. We're developing the rules around this right now. But it really ties back to the fuel mix disclosure that utilities, have been doing for many years now, and what has been added as a result of CETA is a requirement that the emissions that are associated with that fuel mix be reported. And, on its face, that could look like a really huge requirement to try to calculate all those emissions depending on the source of the power and all that. But we're working with the Department of Ecology, developing rules that they will be adopting to kind of set out the math for that. We anticipate that will be pretty close to an automatic process where when the utilities submit their fuel mix information, it'll have the detail on particular resources that utility is using to serve its retail customers. And then the ecology rule will specify how to convert those megawatt hours into greenhouse gas emissions. So the report we think can be integrated between those two things, fuel mix and emissions reporting. That one we expect to start next year on the emissions part. Of course, the fuel mix is an annual report to Commerce, and that'll be coming up this summer as usual. And then the second part of the reporting cycle are the clean energy implementation plan submissions. So this is one where the the planning and the reporting intersect and kind of become all one thing. The law requires that the utilities prepare a clean energy implementation plan, and then that needs to be submitted. It becomes a reporting requirement to submit that clean energy implementation plan. So the first one of those will be due on the 1st of January of 2022, and then it's on a 4-year cycle after that. The third category here are reports to demonstrate compliance with CETA. And there's not anything in the statute that's specific about those. It just says that the Department of Commerce is to adopt rules concerning reporting of compliance with CETA. And so what we're imagining will develop in rules will be after the fact reporting, where you take a compliance period or an interim period. First one being that 2022 to 2025 compliance period. There would be a report after the fact about what the utility did to move toward the 2030 standard, and maybe even the 2045 standard. So that report would be a place where the utility would compare targets that it would have set for the interim period to the actuals. And the same sort of report would come following the second interim period. And then once we get to 2030, those compliance reports we anticipate would be on a 4-year cycle, be done after the conclusion of a 4-year period. And at that point, the utilities would be, instead of forecasting what might be happening in the future, they'd be showing how they actually complied during that period. There was a question in the chat box at the end of the last session or over the break about when would you need to have renewable energy certificates if you were using those as part of your compliance. And we anticipate that that would be something that, the utility might actually be acquiring those RECs as they go along the way. But after the 4-year period is over, they would be able to make any adjustments or whatever so that the actual compliance matches up with the actual loads during that period. The RECs could be retired at that point, and information about that could be submitted in the compliance report that's submitted to the Department of Commerce. And then the last area of reporting has to do with low-income assistance programs, and we're going to save the discussion of those to the next section. That fits a lot better with the material there on the role of energy assistance programs in CETA. And then, of course, there's, again, it's not new, but there will continue to be the every 2 years a new report on the resource plan that the utilities will submit, just as they have in the past. There's a an added element to that report. But the kind of the fundamentals around the submission of those plans doesn't change. September of every even numbered year is when the utilities make their submission. The plan itself, might not have been produced immediately before that point. There's some variation among the utilities in exactly when they prepare their resource plans, update those as they go along. But every September is when we collect those resource plan reports and the integrated resource plans from the larger utilities, and then compile those to a report that we submit to the legislature and that is used in various different programs, however it may be useful to people. So those are the reporting requirements that I wanted to go over with people. And of course, those are then kind of mapped out in that illustrative schedule. And I think what I'd like to do now is just open it up to questions that people may have about these requirements that are coming up.
Good morning. This is Sandy Edgman from the city of Richland.
Good morning, Sandy.
A bright spot, if I may offer that. We all have concerns about what this is doing to our world and how we're going to comply. And I really appreciate Commerce listening and taking our comments. On greenhouse gas emissions, I recently, this is just an aside, but to alleviate concerns of how much of an exercise this is, I recently had a customer that asked for our fuel source mix in terms of carbon equivalents. And it was a very easy exercise once I had the carbon equivalent numbers. I did engage BPA for this, and then also talked with Greg Norstein from Commerce, and I did find it quite easy to do. So it was a matter of taking the fuel reporting and the percentage and just multiplying it by a carbon equivalent.
Thank you for that feedback.
We have a question in the chat, Glenn. The question is, can we use the resource plan as a single plan to meet the requirements of CETA?
We use the resource plan as a single plan to meet the requirements of CETA. I think it's certainly the case that a utility could develop a single product that complied with resource plan requirement and CEIP, Clean Energy Implementation Plan. That's the new requirement. They can flow together very logically, and really should be consistent with each other. So I do think it's worth exploring that idea of having a single product that meets both of those requirements. Those would not substitute for the after the fact compliance report, because one of them looking forward into the future, what you intend to do. Compliance report afterwards shows how you did, how that compared to the legal requirements or the targets that you set for yourself.
Thanks, Glenn. I also got a message about and a question concerned whether it was cutting in
Speak
or
up
out.
a little bit, Austin. I'm having trouble hearing you.
So I got a question about your microphone and making sure that you weren't cutting in and out. And you're not. It just seems that over the course of these workshops that your mic shuts on and off. It's very reactive to when you speak and when you don't speak. So should be no concern on the part of participants that they're missing anything. It's just that your mic. turns on and turns off.
And I will try to do my best to speak up, but trail off sometimes the way I do. So it's a little bit of a struggle to use this format for everybody, and I appreciate everybody making their best effort at it. And this using the chat box and stuff, it's kind of like if we were in a workshop and we were scribbling little notes down and passing them up to the front of the room. Not exactly the best form of conversation.
Any questions about reporting? Does anyone want to themselves or submit a question in the chat box?
I'm gonna just for the fun of it, switch back to the. People see that illustrative schedule on the screen now?
Yes.
Okay, good. I just thought I'd put that up there, maybe to spark any questions or discussion that anyone had. It does include in it some of those low-income assessments and reports that Sarah's going to be talking about here in a few minutes. You can see if we look at the first interim period that goes from 2022 to 2025, there's a forward-looking clean energy implementation plan that will be due January of 2022. And if we scroll down to 2026, we get to at some point in 2026, there would be a interim compliance report that covers that period. We put July 2026 in here, as a possible date for that report to be due. There's no rule on that yet. But anyway, at some point at the conclusion of that first 4-year period, utility would submit a compliance report that showed their use of renewable and non-emitting resources, their achievement on the targets that they had set, and more generally, the progress that they made toward achieving the 2030 greenhouse gas standard, including the requirement in that standard for an equitable distribution of benefits. And then if they were using any alternative compliance options, such as renewable energy credits or energy transformation projects, they would include that information in the report. Or if they were using the cost mechanism to limit their investment in renewables and non-emitting resources, then they would report the information to support that in their compliance report.
Glenn, we have a question and a comment. The question is, can a joint action agency such as Energy Northwest single compliance report on behalf of several utilities?
I believe that that would be possible to do. The individual utilities are going to be responsible for content of the report with respect to their own utility. And will need to be detailed enough to, to show that result. But generally speaking, that ability to both plan on a common basis, report compliance on a common basis is something that we think is very much consistent with the statute and makes a lot of sense from our perspective too.
Then our comment was consolidating these reports into a single report would be very beneficial to small utilities.
Right. And the utilities probably know more about this than I do, but the existing requirements for fuel mix and resource plans, the compliance with those requirements benefits greatly from support that is provided by the Bonneville Power Administration, and then I think also Greg's group does some of that work on behalf of some of the smaller utilities. So I would expect that there could be some supporting efforts made. I'm not promising anything from BPA. I would get in trouble if I did that. But just in general, for the same reasons that BPA has been very helpful to its customers on fuel mix and resource plans, they may be able to help out with some of the, in particular, the compliance side of the reporting here.
And just to keep us on track, I think we're going to move on to the next section, but we're going to have an opportunity at the end of the workshop to again pick up any dangling threads. So just as our resident timekeeper, want to make sure we keep on schedule.
Well, thank you. I am going to switch back.
Go back the mic.
to back to the PowerPoint then?
We are.
Okay. I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Vorpal. Thank you, everybody, for patience during my section of this. And here's Sarah.
Great. Thanks, Glenn. So yeah, we're just going to go through the requirements around low-income assistance programs. So if we go to the next slide. Great. And I just want to first say I've gotten an incredible amount of support and feedback from utilities, including many, many small utilities on this work. So I want to upfront highlight the engagement thus far on this section of CETA, which kind of lives as its own piece of work and is really going to have some kind of lasting work going forward about how we think about really in general the safeguards for rates and vulnerable populations, but the low-income energy assistance program work that is already kind of well underway in Washington and will continue to be looked at. So this part of CETA has three mandates for electric utilities. So the first is that that utilities will now provide energy assistance funding and programs to low-income households starting July 31st, 2021. And so starting next year, you'll only be needing to show that utilities are providing this funding and program. Many of you, if not most, are already doing this. And then the next step in that piece of compliance is to demonstrate progress over time in providing energy assistance. And we'll dig into a little bit more of what that's going to mean. And then finally, prioritizing low-income households, with especially those that have high energy burden. And so this idea of high energy burden is really at the heart of how we're thinking about energy assistance in the state. So if we go to the next slide, we can pull back a little and see that the definition of energy assistance in CETA is actually quite broad compared to what many may think of. And so in this definition, it starts as having this idea of being around energy burden. So, energy assistance means a program undertaken by a utility to reduce the household energy burden of its customers. That's really at the heart of what we're talking about. And that assistance can come in the form of things that you may already be very familiar with, weatherization, conservation, and efficiency programs, as well as rate discounts, and any other mechanism that is intended to lower a household energy burden. However, energy assistance in CETA can also have a broader read, which is it can include direct customer ownership in something like a low-income community solar program or other demand-side management measures, so something like a demand response program. But again, this is, strategies that are, in addition to all these ones listed in sub-A here, and that are actually achieving a reduction in energy burden for customers. So if we go on to the next slide, we can think through some of the definitions that the Commission, the Utilities Transportation Commission, and Commerce have been working on together. I will also point you to, we had a really great workshop at the end of January, and just a really great presentation from some experts on this issue. So if you want to go take a look at that, it's on our website, and maybe I can have Austin throw a link in the chat box. So, through a lot of conversation and thinking through the statute and what we want to get accomplished, we've come up with a couple definitional frameworks to think about this work. So the first is energy burden, which is defined as the amount of annual home energy expenses as a function of your annual household income. And just to put some sideboards on that, because there's not 100% clear, that is limited to expenses for residential domestic purposes. So that means we're excluding things to the extent practicable, such as home businesses or shops, agricultural or irrigation purposes. And when we're thinking about the top part of that equation, in terms of the fuel sources that go into home energy expenses, just making clear that we're thinking across all fuel sources, for energy. So electricity, natural gas, propane, heating, wood, oil. So it may be the case that your utility doesn't touch pieces of those sources of energy, like that you're not responsible for those. But when we're thinking about identifying households, we want to understand their total burden. So we'll get more into that in a minute. It also excludes non-energy utilities and other transportation-related expenses. So it does not include, gasoline for your car. And then to, again, the extent practicable, it doesn't include electric vehicle charging, though I think that will be an evolving conversation about how we're going to parse out end uses in bills. So if we go to the next slide, we can kind of do the next step from, okay, so now we have this idea of what energy burden is and how it's defined, and now we want to set a threshold for what that means so that we can really identify who these priority households are in the state. And in statute, the energy assistance definition kind of is this broad definition around, needing to achieve a level of household energy burden established by the Department and the Commission. So working together, and after our last joint workshop, the Commission and the Department have come up with this definition, which is that the threshold for determining energy assistance need is set at 6% energy burden. So really what we're talking about is an affordability level. So if you're paying 6% or greater of your annual income to home energy bills, then you have energy assistance need. And this group is the target group for this work. And just to get you a little bit more detail on where that number comes from, it's widely used in a lot of different reports. I have one example here. If you're interested, the notice for this workshop has a ton of resources if you want to dig deeper. But in general, folks that work on affordability for housing set a shelter cost at 30%, that shelter cost should not exceed 30% of one's income. And then the utility portion of that 30% should not exceed 20%, making the overall energy burden for home utilities 6%. Okay, so then if we move on to the next definition, part of the mandate that I mentioned was about prioritizing low-income households that have this high energy burden, so those that are above 6%. And low income in the case of CETA can mean one of two things, either the higher of 80% area median income or 200% federal poverty level. And those are the ceilings that are set in statute. And again, it's on a partnership with the Department of Commerce and the Commission to think about how to set this level. And we decided at Commerce that this first round of collecting data, which I'm going to talk about in just a second, we really want to understand the whole picture of programs that are out there. So we have not set a threshold yet between these two that are in statute. We haven't chosen one. We want to collect program information on anything that would either be using either 200% federal poverty level or 80% area median income to qualify eligible households. So that's how we're going to collect data. And then we will establish a more specific definition for low income by the end of the year. The Commission has draft rules where they include 200% federal poverty level. And that's one that's typically used for a lot of federal programs and state programs as well, including a lot of our income qualified programs like SNAP. Great, and we'll just move on to the next slide. Okay, so now we're going to kind of take all those definitions and talk through the work. And, I see a question here, and so it's actually going to tee me up perfectly to talk through this. So to think about the low-income energy assistance programs, what we really need at a basic statewide level is the amount of need versus how much is going out and to whom. And this is not something that exists currently. So there's different pieces of work that we're going to be doing starting now, but going on every 2 years to really get a better understanding of what these needs look like across the state. And I just want to say up front that this is a brand new stream of data collection happening at the state level. And so we really are going to need to think about this as sort of an iterative process and have a little bit of flexibility as we figure out, both how to collect the data from utilities, but then also how to kind of aggregate and publish that data. And I just want to also say here, and I'll talk about it a little bit more later, there will be a technical advisory group that will help Commerce making these decisions and thinking about this work. So the data collection that I'm talking about, the first piece is utilities data that they provide to Commerce. So the data that's required there is the amount and type of energy assistance and the number and type of households served. Now, when I say type of households, I mean, renter-occupied, owner-occupied are kind of the two most basic breakdowns, but there are also a lot of other breakdowns, including, multifamily, mobile, 1, 2, 3 units, et cetera. And there's some databases that hold that data at a statewide level, but I do recognize and have heard from many small utilities that it's not the type of data that they hold in-house. So I am aware of that. And it's a topic for the technical advisory group to think about. And then the other piece is the amount of money that's passed through to third parties that administer energy assistance programs. So your CAP agencies or other community-based organizations that you may give money to that may administer, say, like a low-income weatherization program or other program. So that's the utility data that will be provided to Commerce. There will be a way, kind of a template to provide that data to Commerce that is also being established right now. So I know there will be lots of questions about that, and I'm happy to think through those with you as well. Then there's the Commerce, then there's statewide data that Commerce will aggregate and make publicly available. And that data is going to include the number and demographic characteristics of households served by energy assistance and the dollar value of the assistance they're receiving, level of energy burden and energy assistance need across the state, housing characteristics, including housing type, home vintage and field types, and then energy efficiency potential. And these pieces of data are ones that we're pulling from national databases and other tools. There are, the hope would be to eventually be able to have a really good statewide picture that is based in kind of, household level data that we're aggregating up from the utilities. However, it's going to be a process to get us there. And again, the technical advisory group is going to be helping us figure out, what's the roadmap to kind of taking this aggregated data across the state and then maybe evolving this to ways that we can get data from utilities and publish, and publish it with these other layers included. So lots of kind of things to think about, but there is already a great deal of this data available. And then, all this data will be made publicly available. And then starting next year, utilities are going to be responsible for developing an assessment report of their programs, looking across a couple of different things. One is the effectiveness of programs, both short-term programs like rate discounts and sustained mechanisms like weatherization, and the effectiveness of those measures to reduce energy burden. Look at outreach strategies that are used to reach prioritized households, including language, access, consultation with tribes, and other, community engagement. And then the third piece is a cumulative assessment of funding levels to meet the two different goals over time towards making progress on energy assistance need. The first is 60% current energy assistance need, so covering 60% of your current need, so anyone over 6% energy burden, or increasing your energy assistance funding by 15% from 2018. From 2018 by 2030. So both of those goals happen by 2030. And then the second goal is covering 90% of current energy assistance need by 2050. So to make that clear, the report would show, what would it actually take to pay for those, to cover that amount of energy assistance needs in your utilities territory. Great. And so those are these three chunks of work, and we're not going to have a ton of time today to talk through all the bits, but I'm really happy to connect offline about it. And if we go to the next slide, we can kind of just see this whole arc of work, through next year. So as I mentioned, the technical advisory group focusing on this data collection will have its first meeting in May. And there are several small utilities that are going to be represented on that committee. So I thank them for their time and so far and their engagement. Starting in July 31st, 2020, there's a statutory deadline that utilities begin submitting data pursuant to the different pieces that I mentioned. And Commerce will also aggregate data as well. So that data collection begins this July. And there's a tentative stop date for that in early November of this year, which we'll think through exactly when we'll stop the collection. But the goal, the reason we want to give ourselves some time is that by the end of this year, Commerce will have wanted to aggregate all that data, both from the utilities and the statewide data, and post it online so that utilities can start looking through it to understand how to set up their assessment report. And then the next part will be, January and March through March of next year, doing more outreach and workshops to think about that assessment report more in depth, because there's still a lot of questions we need to answer. What does making progress mean? And then, for this group, how do we think about these reporting requirements and the needs to cover energy assistance program funding for smaller utilities? So I'd be very interested to hear, if not, more in-depth conversations today, but, later and offline, what needs we need to make sure we're thinking about for the small utilities in our state. And then starting for next year, we will spin up another technical advisory committee that's going to help us think through those questions. So there's an opportunity there, and small utility membership will definitely be a part of that committee. And then finally, to kind of coincide with the mandate that by July 31st, 2021, all utilities have to have program and funding for low-income household energy assistance programs, we'll also have the first assessment report due, and that'll be our kind of compliance check for that mandate. And just as a note, the data period we're talking about is from January 1st, 2019 through December 31st, 2019. So the 2019 data period, which I know there's several kind of moving timelines for utilities in terms of cycles like LIHEAP, but that one kind of seemed just to make the most sense in terms of clean and working overtime. And with that, I am going to pause and see if there's any clarifying questions on anything I've talked about.
Sarah, we have 2 quick questions, and someone just raised their hand. The first question is, who will be collecting the data identifying household income? Question, or it's a comment, is please share who is on the technical advisory groups. And maybe you'd like to take a moment to talk about the technical advisory groups more depth.
Yeah, and Austin, can we go back a slide? And Greg,
Glenn,
I think you, oh, I'm sorry, I mean, Glenn, can we go back one slide? Thank you. Greg, I think you asked this before I got to this slide, but I'll still just reiterate that the utilities are going to be owing us data on the type of energy assistance and to how many and which kinds of households. The identifying data around household income and any other demographics is going to be data that Commerce is aggregating. With that being said, if a utility has a good way, if they have maybe a smaller amount of households that they're looking at and a really, and work with their local community action agency a bit, and that community action agency holds good demographic information about your district, I'm happy to use, pre-existing data or other work, program information that a community action agency or other community-based organization in your utility district may have. I understand that it is not likely that a utility is going to have kind of the household demographic information. So hopefully that answers that question. The second piece is around the technical advisory group. And so the membership for that is, it's evolving. I have sent out an email and I'm pulling that together as we speak. And the people that will be represented on it are, let's see, it's someone from an IOU, someone from a PUD, someone from a rural co-op, someone from a low-income advocacy group, someone from an environmental advocacy group, someone from a CAP agency. And I believe, if I'm pulling up, I haven't heard back from everyone, so I don't want to call anyone out, but Christina Hyatt from Big Bend has said she'll be on, just this morning, has said that she'll be on the committee. So thank you so much, Christina, for being able to do that. And then there's some others as well. And then there will also be folks from, and a municipal utility will also be represented. We are also pulling in our LIHEAP and weatherization folks from Commerce. So Amanda Rains and Brian Sarensen, and then a new kind of data specialist who's going to help us really think through how to collect data and really these technical questions that we have. And her name is Anna Beatty. So hopefully that answers that question. I will be posting, once I get confirmation from everyone, I'll be posting the full membership online along with a scope of work.
Greg, you have your hand up. You have a follow-up question?
Yeah, and Sarah, thanks for answering that. I actually had a question, and I was hoping you could help me. And this is something that I haven't dug into a whole bunch. So if this is a dumb question, I apologize. But I'm looking at kind of the slide that you're on, slide 24, and kind of the flow of the passive data, and then what Commerce is going to do, and then the utility assessment. Can you crosswalk for me on the Commerce stuff that I'm staring at? Specifically kind of the level of need, the EE potential, things like that. Is that something where you are going to be developing something brand new to do that, or is that something that you guys currently do for the state of Washington?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we don't currently do, Commerce does not currently do this entire suite of things for the state of Washington. I think there are certainly data that live in our LIHEAP database that would touch on some of this. We've done little kind of pilots or pieces of this, particularly looking at where funding has gone for some of our specific programs. But this is the first time we're really pulling together this whole suite of things with the intention of thinking across all these different layers. And so the hope when we put this list together was that all of this data already lives in some sort of way, either at a federal level or in a public resource. So, this first time out, Commerce is not creating anything new. So for example, the level of energy burden and energy assistance need, we're going to be leveraging data from the Department of Energy's LEAD tool, so their low-income energy assistance data tool. And I'm happy to, as soon as I pause talking, I can put a link into the chat box here. But that tool shows kind of a census tract level or county level. You can choose picture of what energy burden looks like averaged across those geographic locations in our state. So, and, it has come to my attention that those aren't, they might not accurately represent all areas because it is sampling data. But I think, I think to get us started, it's a really good tool and one that's been used in a lot of places. What our hope is for, the demographic characteristics in households, that also is in the LEAD tool. So you got low-income data in there. You got income level data as well as household type data. Home vintage, fuel type are in that LEAD tool. So some of the others, energy efficiency potential is something, we've got the Northwest Power Council and some other, and NREL and the National Renewable Energy Lab hold some data, relating to energy efficiency potential. So we're still kind of trying to figure out the best way to combine these two pieces of data. Maybe there's an opportunity to combine the LEAD tool with something like ResStock, which looks at energy efficiency potential at NREL. So if you are someone looking at this and you know of a great data resource, please don't hesitate to reach out and let us know. So right now we're just sort of piecing all of this together.
Perfect. Yeah, I bring it up, and I'm glad to hear that you're doing coordination with other folks. In a small utility vein, thinking about this, a lot of our members are wholly reliant, obviously, on BPA's implementation manual and programs, and so the one aspect I do worry about when it comes to something like this is another competing forecast of what's available out there that might not fully link up with what BPA is offering or saying, what the Northwest Power Council is offering or saying, or maybe even what the larger Washington state utilities are doing or saying with their own energy conservation potential assessments. So I'm in my head, I'm thinking, hopefully this links up to everything, but I know that that's probably a really hard thing to do as well, and I'm worried or concerned that it might be another competing report that says, hey, you could do this, and BPA may not be offering things of that nature through their programs that the small utilities are, again, wholly reliant on. And so those are the types of things that I hope you guys are considering and thinking about as you're looking at this, making sure that you are making those connections with the folks who are providing the small utilities with both the programs, the technical assistance, the funding, frankly, and things of that nature.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. I think it's really important to do this in a way that we can talk across all utilities. I think that was the intent behind the work, was to make sure that, was to try to evolve the data that we have into an apples to apples resource that we can understand, what the energy assistance need is versus what the potential is to do different kinds of work across the state. So I do appreciate that. I would also leverage something that Glenn said earlier, if there's utilities that would like to work together to come up with kind of a standard way to do this. I know that there are utilities in the state that have already pursued this kind of reporting and looking across all this data. So I know that there's an opportunity there to think together about, how to report in sort of a apples to apples way and not have it be something that's counter or, competing, as you say, with other ways that reporting is happening in the state. I also see a real quick question about energy burden based on heating and cooling only, or if it's total household usage. That the intent would be to make sure that it's total household usage, excluding the two, or the kinds of, electric vehicle charging and other commercial applications that might happen at someone's household. So just wanted to touch that real quick. I also want to interrupt myself because I want to keep us on schedule. And we're going to kind of move into a section where we open the question and answers back up to anything that might be dangling. So we can continue talking about this low-income energy assistance program work. But I did want to make sure that we're moving through and respecting everyone's time. So at this point, I'm going to stop talking and open the floor to anyone that, actually, Austin, I know we had some backlog questions, so I might move away from low-income energy assistance at this point and go back to questions that got asked in the chat box that I know Austin was collecting, and then I can come back around and answer more questions.
Yeah, well, everyone.
Austin, yeah, why don't you do that?
Everyone is digesting the low-income energy assistance. Let's go back to those questions. First was more of a comment that was made earlier for us just to be mindful of the impacts of reporting on small utilities. The person commenting noted that they have 1,500 connections and a neighboring utility that only has 240. Just about the burden of that. They wanted that noted. Then we had a comment. So if the purchase of RECs has a 2% rate impact, will we be assessed a penalty? Glenn?
I think I already addressed that. I'm scrolling back up, but
this one we didn't address. There was a number of very similar questions, but I believe
so
you probably touched on this.
In this hypothetical where purchase of RECs in order to reach 100% greenhouse gas neutral, if the cost of those RECs exceeded 2% of the utilities revenue prior year, then it's not that there would be a penalty assessed, it's that utilities' obligation to purchase RECs would be limited to that 2% amount. And then, of course, the next year that it would be a fresh requirement to look again at the additional cost in that year and compare that to the 2% of the prior year revenue. But it's not that a penalty would be assessed, it's that the obligation to meet the standard is mitigated.
Thanks, Glenn. The next question, I believe you addressed this one. A utility does not exactly know what its load will be and what its unbundled REC purchase needs to be for a given year. Hope we can touch base on this issue at a later time. Okay. And I believe you.
And it is over a 4-year period. You know, my guess is utilities would more frequently than at the end of the 4 years, you know, figure out their compliance approach. But they can adjust as they go through that 4-year period. It's only at the end of the 4 years that they need to, at that point, they'll know what their load was and they'll know what it takes to comply, and they can kind of complete their compliance actions at that point.
Then our next question references 040 and 050. I don't know if we want to go back to that slide. But the question is, regarding the requirement that a utility must complete its CETA 10-year action plan by December 31st, 2020, Have the scope and contents of this plan been defined beyond the language in RCW 040 050? For example, is the primary purpose of the CETA 10-year action plan to describe the planning and decision-making process the utility intends to use to ensure it will comply with CETA, or does it need to include actual compliance actions?
So I would look at the language in 19280 030, which is the requirements of the resource plan. And my understanding of what that new requirement is that the utility will identify the actions it intends to take over the next 10 years in order to comply with those future standards. So it wouldn't necessarily go into detail about their planning or decision-making processes, but it would identify the actions that they intend to take. And of course, the first one in particular that comes up at the end of this year, the utilities planned actions may be fairly nascent. There may not be a lot of detail in what they intend to do to meet the future standards, and we don't intend between now and the end of the year to do anything in the way of a rule that would kind of surprise the utilities about you need to do this specific thing or that specific thing. It's part of that the 10-year action plan that comes up at the end of this year. It can be based on the utilities actual decision making and planning processes, and to give a report out about what their plans are at this point.
And Sarah, we had a question, or a comment, I should say. HEAP uses 8% for energy burden. CETA is asking for 6%. It seems like we can streamline activity, reducing administrative complications by using the LIHEAP/federal standard.
Yeah, Tyler, thanks for pointing that out. I definitely agree that we should be talking about how to streamline this process. So thank you for noting the differences there, and something that we'll make sure to talk to our LIHEAP folks about. If we don't have any other questions at this point, we can leave the line open a bit. I do want to move us on. Oh, I'm sorry, Nicholas, was there a?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Again, I'm not sure exactly how to raise my hand, so this is a verbal question.
Go for it.
So two questions, really. First of all, you touched on this a second ago, but the definition of low income, it's the higher of the 200% of the federal poverty line, or 6%, I guess. And I guess it would be good to understand a little more what went into that decision. I'm specifically thinking about the practical implications. There are some utilities whose customers are very income challenged, to say the least, and you could end up with a situation that half or more of their customers would meet the standard, and at that point, a utility really has almost no tools to deal with this, because they can't have that kind of income shift among customers. So the first question is that, and the second question. Oh, the other thing I want to point out is that I recollect that the joint meeting that you all had with the UTC, the main presenter was saying you should really base the low income definition on ability to pay, rather than a fixed number. And I'm just curious, does that recommendation go by the wayside, or how you're dealing with that? And the second question is simply, like for planning, I would assume that the ability of the small utilities to do a bunch of these assessments is going to be extraordinarily difficult. or it's going to, they just don't, don't have the personnel or the technical capabilities to do this. And so are you all thinking about a tiered approach where the larger utilities could do more in-depth analysis and the smaller utilities would have a lighter burden? Or are you thinking that you need to do the same amount of analysis no matter your size? Thank you.
Thanks, Nicholas. Yeah, I'll take the last part first. I think I'm definitely, we would definitely be open to thinking about reporting requirements and how they might be different for very small utilities, especially with lower capacity. So that question will be one that I definitely intend to make part of the technical advisory group that will spin up around the assessment report next year. So I will look forward to flagging that issue and making sure that we're able to talk about that. To answer your question about the definitions, the definitions were chosen based on many workshops and a lot of public comment. So if you want to review all of those public comments, both the docket from the UTC as well as the public comment to Commerce provides a really rich amount of information that people have provided. So again, thank you for everyone for providing that information to us. So for low income, the definition could be either 200% federal poverty level or 80% area median income. So that was the definition we were trying to think through. The 200% federal poverty level line is one that is used in many programs already in the state that are income qualified. And I think the commission leaned on that one, if I had to guess, because of its ability to be implemented, but I think also based on comment that we heard that was what most people used, and it was kind of the easiest in terms of administrative burden. The 6% number for energy burden is one that comes from, again, many other kinds of references that we had brought to us and that were aggregated through a kind of extensive comment period around that question. I know that Roger Colton, who presented at the workshop, brought up a lot of kind of things for us to think about, including different phased approaches or ability to pay. And I think the biggest take home I got from his presentation was just thinking about an affordability level and what it means, and how to make sure that the people in your district are, or identifying the people in the district that aren't able to afford their bills. And is the 6% number going to be, kind of the most, the best one across every single location and circumstance? Probably not. But again, trying to think through a cleaner way to identify those households to get us started. I think there's much opportunity to evolve this work over time. And so I'd really love to hear, Nicholas, ideas for how we can be a little more, precise as we move this work forward. So yeah, definitely appreciate you bringing that up. And I think I got all your questions. I also want to respect our time because we do have about 12 minutes left, and we have one other chunk of things that we just wanted to put up on the presentation for you. But I will pause a second and see if there's any other questions, remaining questions or concerns. We'll probably have time for one more, just from everything we've talked about today. Okay, if there's not, Glenn, why don't we go to the next slide, and I'm going to pass the mic back to you, as it were, and have you talk through every other thing else that we did not cover today, which is a lot.
And we really and truly are not intending to cover these topics today. The scope of this workshop is the reporting and planning requirements, and what areas within that might benefit from having a rule developed. Which ones are good enough just the way they are, no rule required, that kind of thing. But I did want to ever so briefly just give you a sense of the other issues that are in discussion in the rulemaking process. We haven't actually done a lot of work on the rules externally. During the legislative session, we had a few workshops, but not a lot. but we're going to be picking up the pace of work as we go forward now. And these are issues that have come up where there might be some uncertainty about exactly what the statute requires, and in which case it may be helpful for the Department of Commerce to interpret the statute in a rule. I also don't want to leave you with the impression that there will be a rule on every one of these subjects. It may very well be the case that for some of these, we say that the statute is plenty good on its own. It doesn't need any further interpretation. But these are the things that are kind of on our list right now, things we're going to be working on as we move ahead in the rulemaking process. I guess the other thing I would say about these is they, generally speaking, don't have a small utility versus large utility aspect to them. These are kind of statutory issues that would probably be the same regardless of the utility involved in them. And if anybody wants to learn more about these, we have several rounds of written comments that we've gone through. It's available on our website. There will be workshops coming up on these. We'll also be putting together draft rules. Our target is by the end of April. That will address various subjects, including planning and reporting, as well as these compliance issues. And when we get to draft rules, that's really when we need the most help in terms of language in those and making sure that it's consistent with the statute and that it makes sense to people who will be needing to work with it going forward in the future. So I don't know that we really have much time left to talk about any of these, but maybe just to leave it as a parting highlight is as much as we should try to do.
Glenn, this is Liz Klump with Bonneville with a quick question. When you mentioned that you'd have draft rules at the end of April, do you mean some draft language for us to read, or do you mean CR 102 language?
Well, I definitely mean that first thing, draft language that's not ready for CR 102. When we get to the CR 102, I call that proposed rule. And it'll be in late summer to fall when we get to that proposed rule stage. But I hope to circulate more than one version in a round of informal drafts for people to look at. Did Greg have his hand up?
Yes, Greg does.
Hey, Glenn. I just wanted to touch back on you're saying a lot of these kind of have no small versus large aspects to it. I think I would, for the methodology for the 2% revenue impact provision, I think the methodology part of it, yeah, I get that part of it, but I'll reiterate kind of the issue that we're facing, which is, small utility based in another state that may have a very small subset of accounts in Washington State. I think that's an issue that needs to be addressed, and it touches a lot of areas, but the 2% revenue impact I think is an important one when you have such a small amount of your total accounts. I think we need to think about that and keep in mind that that this is impacting not just Washington state only utilities, but utilities in neighboring states that have a small amount of Washington customers as well.
I agree that we should take a look at that, Greg, and see what we can figure out.
Perfect. Thank you.
We have no further questions. I'd like to mention that you can find all of these topics, the workshops on these topics, and our upcoming hearings, or workshops, I should say, on our webpage, which I posted the link in the chat box. Please sign up for our weekly bulletin where we will continue to make updates to the schedule and comment deadlines for draft rule language.
And, you know, we do have these kind of rounds of comments that will, you know, where we'll ask for comments by a particular date on a particular topic. But I would also invite you to, you know, after you've thought about the presentation that we made today, if there are comments or suggestions that you have, feel free to submit those to us, you know, even though there's not some specific request for that, or, you know, no specific deadline to do it. We take comments on a rolling basis. So if there's something that it would be helpful for us to know, please send it our way.
You will also be able to find the recording of this presentation under past workshops on our page. Probably by the middle of this week. It takes some time for the recording to finalize and be uploaded, but it'll be there in the middle. I'd like to review them.
All right, are we ready to conclude then? Any last questions or remarks? All right, in that case, thank you everybody for your participation, and be safe out there. We look forward to seeing you in person one of these days. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
You, bye.